Welcome to this reflection after our morning Zoom service with Acomb, Holgate and South London Methodist Churches. And this morning our service was led by Reverend Louise Grossberg, and she helped us reflect on Acts 16 and the first half of the chapter, looking at Paul's travels and meeting with Lydia. She takes us through now in a little extract from our worship this morning. We've removed the reflections and conversations we have, and you're invited to make your own responses. Perhaps pause the video and response at the questions. But I introduce Louise. Thank you.
Start off with this verses 1 to 3.5. So Paul came to Derbe and came to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey. And I'm just going to stop there. So, keen to get moving, Paul comes to Derbe and then to Lystra. And then we're told that he meets with Timothy, who the community think a lot of, and Paul chooses him as a companion. So just thinking about the Lord opening our hearts in this passage, perhaps we all need reminding every now and again that we are loved, eternally loved, loved by our community, that we all have gifts, no matter what our circumstance. And just as Paul sees potential in Timothy, God sees potential in us, even if some days we feel we can't possibly agree with him. And perhaps the pandemic has given us all a real struggle sometimes of a sense of purpose and to find meaning in our lives. We said last week, for those of you who were with us at our covenant service, I am no longer my own but yours, which is a huge prayer. And we can only make that prayer through the power of the Holy Spirit. But we can also only make that prayer as a community. Lord sees potential in all of us, and therefore sees potential in us as a community meeting together. And we must be community for one another now more than ever before. And that means we use all of our gifts, and together we can see glimpses of heaven on earth and become hope bearers ourselves for the communities that we live in. So a real sense with this couple of little verses to start off with, how the Lord sees potential in all of us, just as Paul sees potential through the Holy Spirit in Timothy. And we're going to go on now to the more difficult little bit. So if I just go on from there, Paul wanted to take him along with the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area. They were all knew that his father was a Greek. As they travelled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and they grew daily in numbers. So this circumcision bit then, that puts a new slant, doesn't it, on Methodist membership classes. It really does. It's that old friend circumcision again, if you can ever describe it like that, which you probably can't. We thought it's not needed anymore. Salvation is through Jesus. Now, a little bit of background. Timothy's mum is Jew. And of course, then the maternal side, just as it does now, really matters. But Timothy's dad was a Greek, so they probably decided together that he wasn't going to be circumcised as a baby. So Paul circumcised Timothy, not because he needed it, but because it was simply going to be simpler for Paul's mission. If his companions were seen to be proper Jews, as they often met in the synagogue to start off with in a new place, so they would be seen as acceptable in a new town. In a way, it's a little bit of a shortcut. And of course, this is the opposite, what happened in relation to Titus in Galatians 2. Titus was a Gentile, and some of the hardliners wanted him to be circumcised before they'd regard him as a proper member of the family, and Paul refused. So, interesting little thought, really. But if we think about opening our hearts and what this may mean to us, how much do you think we should be shaped by the culture we find ourselves in, perhaps in order to walk the walk as well as talk the talk? So, very simple little example is for me. I work in the hospital as a chaplain, and there's always lots and lots of discussion among healthcare chaplains as to whether you should wear a dog collar or not, especially obviously if you're a Christian chaplain and you've been ordained. Now, we do in York, but because of the pandemic, a lot of chaplains are wearing scrubs. And actually some chaplains are saying, you know, it's open doors more than when we ever perhaps turn up on the ward with our own clothes and a dog collar on. So that's just a very minor example, which is about my work and the pros and cons, because obviously in York, if I wear my dog collar, it's a shortcut. People know who I am, they know what I stand for, but it can put barriers up, and we're aware of that. So that's just a little bit about my culture that I work in. How much do you think we should be shaped by the culture that we find ourselves in, and perhaps, you know, go alongside people? Is there a danger that we let things that are precious to us go if we immerse ourselves too much in that culture? Anybody? Yeah, I mean, we've all got our frontline ministries, haven't we? Whether it's meeting somebody who's delivering our Tesco at the moment, our Tesco delivery, or going for vaccines or whatever, wherever we are, we can very quietly be that presence of Christ, which is really important, isn't it? And I think I've found if I pray for that day, that I might have those opportunities and those expectations. You know what? Things happen. And it really truly is remarkable. So yeah, thank you all so much for that. We're just going to move on to the next few verses, and then there's an opportunity for all of you to just put what you think as to regards the next question. So the next few verses are 6 to 12. Paul and his companions travelled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So, as a reasonably green new minister, many years ago now, I sat in a congregation to welcome in the start of the Methodist New Year in September, and we were welcoming a new colleague to the circuit that I was serving in at the time. Now, this guy was really experienced, and so I was really shocked to hear him declare at the circuit service on, in essence, his first day in the circuit, a circus then, but there you go, it sometimes feels like a circus, that he looked back, that he had thrown himself into ministry and had done so. He'd seen much was achieved, and yet how many years later he'd gone back to the time and place that he was serving in, and one of the chapels where he'd thrown himself into doing so much was now a carpet warehouse. And so he declared at that circuit service, so this time I'm not going to be doing a lot. So I was a bit surprised because I was like young and keen and, you know, gosh, of course you don't come in your first day say I'm not going to be doing a lot. But actually I understood in time what he meant, because what he'd done in the past had all been really good ideas, but perhaps hadn't been so spirit-led. And this guy actually had an incredible ministry, and he actually achieved so much, and we saw people come to faith due to the way he was leading the church at that time in the community. But it was all done with backing of prayer and love and being led by the Spirit. And I think as I look back, I now know exactly what he meant, because I've also thrown at ministry good ideas that are not necessarily God ideas. And God ideas can often, as it says in the covenant service, feel contrary to our own natural inclinations and material interests. It's not always easy to be led by the Holy Spirit and to really pray into what we perhaps should be doing as a community or as a church. The pattern of our lives as we seek to follow Jesus did not always run smoothly. Perhaps the last year, more than any other year, has shown that. And it seems that old adage is correct: if you want to make God laugh, show him your plans. Mm-hmm. So the company in Acts travel, no doubt extremely excited to see what God will do next. They were up for it. But instead, they travel hundreds of miles on foot. Now, some of you will know how frustrating it is to know that you're going to get something upstairs, and you run upstairs and you get there and you can't remember what it is. And you have to come down again. And you perhaps do that 2 or 3 times before you eventually get it. You know, these people were really wanting to pursue God in their time, in their place. And yet, seemingly, they just ran into one barrier after another. This is hundreds of miles, not just going upstairs. This goes on and on and on, where they see that the Spirit just stops them going into where they perhaps thought was a good idea, as well as those times when the door opens. And perhaps this serves to remind us that God is in charge of the mission. Not even Andy, although we thought it was him, but it seems that it's God's in charge of the mission. And that the church often searches for God's calling in mistaken directions and aborted attempts. And that God's Spirit often speaks through frustrating and difficult discernment. You know, perhaps in so many ways, I put my hand up to this as a minister who used to work in circuit, that sometimes we've been very much building focused rather than actually what God is doing with the community. There are trials and there's triumphs, and then finally Paul has a vision of a man from Macedonia asking him to come to him, and he concludes that the Lord wants us to preach the gospel there. The man says, come over and help us. And I'm just wondering, for all of us, can you recognise any of this in your life, or does this feel like really weird? God's never sent you in a particular direction or asked you to do something. Have you ever been aware of when you believed that God was calling you to go somewhere, or indeed stopping you? And I'm going to ask us all, and don't get worried because you think, oh, I don't want to speak. It's a poll, all right? So, you know, I think perhaps what to do. There's a questionnaire I know there are times when God has stopped me going somewhere or speaking to someone, or that God has prompted me to go somewhere or speak to someone that the door was open. Now, in essence, is saying, do you feel or have you felt when God is asking you to do something? It's not just a good idea. And are you aware that this happens often? A, occasionally. B, hardly ever. C, or D, I've never known this to happen. I've never been aware of when God may be prompting me to go somewhere or to speak to someone. It particularly happens to me very often. I have to be aware, because this is quite often, I have to be aware pastorally. So say if I've got somebody in the hospital and I just somehow suddenly just know I've got to go and visit that person. And now sometimes is that resistant, because I think, oh no, but I've got to do A, B and C. And you know, the number of times that's happened and I haven't followed that almost inner voice, that I've really regretted it. So I think it is just realizing that actually God is speaking to us. And actually, I think even if we get it wrong, it just shows that we're wanting to give our hearts to God and wanting to follow God's lead in all of this. So I really hope that we can continue to tune in to God's heart and that he can open our hearts to hear him, and that expectation that actually this week God may lead us to ring someone or to go somewhere. I know you can't go many places at the moment, where actually God is leading rather than it being a good idea. And if you've never known God lead you, perhaps you could ask God to open your heart to that leading, that you may know when to perhaps act through God's Holy Spirit, when the Spirit may be prompting you. And finally, back to verse 15, 13 even, and we're back to where we started. On the Sabbath, we went outside to the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay in my house. And she persuaded us. So we're back to the start. There are all sorts of questions you may like to ask about this passage. You may like to debate further. Was Paul right in ensuring Timothy was circumcised? How far can we go to compromise our actions so we can speak to different people about the gospel? You may like to consider a question that is debated in the commentaries about why in verse 10 we suddenly have a we creeping in. What does that mean? Who joined the party? And all of these are really interesting questions. But faith is not just an intellectual exercise. It's often beyond our understanding. It transcends our good ideas and what we should be doing to draw in a crowd or to sort of sort church out because COVID-19 has arrived on our doorstep. The Lord opened Lydia's heart. She and her household were baptized, and her hospitality is saying yes. Her giving her resources to God was just a small part in seeing the kingdom come, of heaven come on earth. Will you pray, Lord, open my heart this week to hear your love for me, your prompting in my life, and to remember that God sees potential in you and in your household. And to help us not just to raise the roof in a few minutes singing, and can it be, therefore, you know what's coming next, but to know that it's truth, that we don't just sing the words. Be prepared to say, yes, and can it be in my life this week? and to help us to know that there'll be times when we have absolutely no idea what to do and where to go. And that's okay. That the walk of faith isn't always easy, but to trust that we'll end up in the right place at the right time. And you know what? God will have changed us as we journey along the way, just as he did with Paul and his companions.
With many thanks to Elise, and thank you for helping us reflect on that. And my reflection is quite often we think of these spirit nudges as maybe feminine intuition, which would be very biblical, because the spirit is known as Sophia in the Old Testament, the spirit of wisdom, and it has that feminine characteristic to it. So maybe be a bit more aware of those nudges and maybe seek them from God rather than waiting for them to appear. One of the hymns we sang this morning was "And Can It Be?" and we just finish our reflection today with that song.
For me, face shine upon you
and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you
and give